November 7th, 1861, Port Royal, South Carolina. Confederate cotton merchant James Hamilton stands on the wooden wharf watching Union warships form a line across the harbor entrance. The morning sun glints off the iron hulls of Federal ships, and Hamilton can hear the rumble of their engines even from shore. Behind him, stacked in orderly pyramids along the waterfront, sit 40,000 bales of cotton worth $5 million. Yesterday, this cotton represented his fortune, his family's future, and the Confederate war effort's primary weapon. Today, as Union Admiral Samuel DuPont's fleet seals off the harbor, every bale becomes worthless. Not burned, not captured, just economically dead. Hamilton understands immediately what's happening. The cotton he was depending on to finance the war, to buy weapons from Europe, to fund the Confederacy, can no longer reach its buyers. It will sit here, rotting in the South Carolina humidity, while the Confederate government goes bankrupt and Confederate armies starve. All around Port Royal, other merchants are reaching the same terrible realization. Their wealth, the South's wealth, the Confederacy's entire economic strategy depends on shipping cotton to Europe, and the United States Navy has just made that impossible. What Hamilton doesn't know yet, what no one in the Confederacy understands in November 1861, is that this is just the beginning. The Union is about to execute the largest naval blockade in history. They will seal off 3,500 miles of Confederate coastline. They will capture or destroy over 1,100 blockade-running ships. They will strangle the Confederate economy so thoroughly that by 1865, inflation will reach 9,000%, and Confederate armies will be literally starving for want of supplies that sit in European warehouses, unable to reach southern ports. The Confederacy bet everything on a simple equation. Europe needs cotton, therefore Europe will support the South. They were catastrophically wrong, and the Union Navy's blockade would prove that industrial sea power could defeat agricultural land power without fighting a single major land battle. This is the story of how the United States Navy won the Civil War by turning the South's greatest asset into its greatest vulnerability. How Union shipyards built vessels faster than the Confederacy could run the blockade. And how economic strangulation proved more devastating than any army could achieve on the battlefield. The blockade didn't just help the Union win. It made Confederate victory impossible from the moment it was established. And sitting in warehouses across the South, millions of bales of worthless cotton stood as monuments to the Confederacy's fatal miscalculation. To understand why the Union blockade worked, you have to understand how completely the Confederacy misunderstood their own economic position. The Confederate government built their entire war strategy around cotton, believing it would be their invincible weapon. They were wrong about everything. In 1860, the southern states produced nearly 4 million bales of cotton annually. This represented about 80% of the world's cotton supply. Britain's textile mills, the industrial heart of the world's most powerful empire, depended on southern cotton for their raw material. France, Belgium, and other European nations were similarly dependent. The logic seemed unassailable. Europe needed cotton desperately. Therefore, Europe would support the Confederacy, or at minimum, break the Union blockade to secure their cotton supply. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his advisors called this King Cotton diplomacy. They believed cotton gave them leverage that no military force could match. They were so confident in this strategy that in the war's first year, they deliberately withheld cotton from export, hoping to pressure Europe into recognizing Confederate independence. This was possibly the worst strategic decision in American military history. The Confederacy's logic had 3 fatal flaws they never recognized until it was too late. First, Britain had massive cotton stockpiles from 1860's record harvest. They had enough raw cotton to keep their mills running for nearly 2 years, even with zero southern imports. Second, British and European investors had millions of pounds invested in Union bonds and northern businesses. Supporting the Confederacy meant risking those investments. Third, and most critically, British and French public opinion was violently opposed to slavery. No European government could support the Confederacy without facing domestic political catastrophe. But the Confederacy didn't understand these realities. They burned cotton, refused to export it, and waited for Europe to come begging. Instead, Europe shrugged and found alternative suppliers in Egypt and India. By the time Confederate leadership realized their mistake, the Union blockade had made cotton export nearly impossible anyway. The mathematics of Confederate delusion were staggering. In 1860, the South exported 2.8 million bales of cotton to Europe. In 1862, after 1 year of blockade and deliberate cotton withholding, exports dropped to 90,000 bales. By 1864, fewer than 10,000 bales reached Europe annually. The Confederacy had taken their greatest economic asset and made it worthless through strategic incompetence and Union naval power. James Hamilton's cotton, sitting on that Port Royal wharf, represented this miscalculation perfectly. The Confederacy had the cotton. Europe wanted the cotton. But the Union Navy had ensured that the two could never meet. And without cotton revenue, the Confederacy couldn't buy the weapons, medicine, food, or supplies their armies desperately needed. Secretary of State William Seward later wrote about Confederate cotton diplomacy. They believed cotton was king. They discovered that ships are queens, and queens rule the seas. The Confederacy might have had the world's cotton, but we controlled access to the world's markets. That control was worth more than all the cotton in Dixie. But in November 1861, as the Union began implementing the blockade, most observers thought it would fail. The task seemed impossible. How could the Union possibly blockade 3,500 miles of coastline with any effectiveness? The Confederacy had dozens of ports, hundreds of inlets, thousands of places where small boats could slip through. The Union Navy at the war's start had only 42 ships in commission, most of them in distant waters. The Confederate coastline stretched from Virginia to Texas, including complex waterways like Chesapeake Bay, the Carolina Sounds, and the Mississippi Delta. Navy Secretary Gideon Welles received the assignment from President Lincoln in April 1861: blockade the entire Confederate coast. Welles understood immediately that it was both absolutely necessary and seemingly impossible. His initial assessment concluded that effective blockade would require at least 200 ships. He had fewer than 50 available, and most were obsolete sailing vessels unsuited for blockade duty. But Welles also understood something the Confederacy didn't. The North possessed the industrial capacity to build a blockading fleet from scratch, and that's exactly what they would do. The Union would build more warships in 4 years than the entire United States Navy had commissioned in the previous 40 years. They would create a blockading force so overwhelming that by 1865, Confederate blockade runners had less than a 50% chance of successfully reaching port. This was the pattern that would repeat throughout the war. The Confederacy assumed the Union couldn't do something because it had never been done before. The Union then proved they could do it by applying industrial capacity to the problem. The blockade, like the railroad construction and telegraph network, would demonstrate that industrial power could overcome any obstacle given sufficient resources and organization. The Confederacy's 9 ships in commission at the war's start faced 42 Union vessels. By 1865, the Union Navy would have over 600 ships, while the Confederacy never had more than about 50 vessels of all types, including converted riverboats and purchased civilian craft. This wasn't a naval war. It was an industrial slaughter where one side kept building ships and the other side couldn't build fast enough to matter. When Gideon Welles took stock of his Navy in April 1861, the situation appeared hopeless. The United States Navy possessed only 42 ships in commission. Of these, only a handful were steam-powered modern vessels. Most were aging sailing ships designed for show-the-flag missions, not combat or blockade duty. Many were stationed overseas, protecting American merchant interests in Africa, Asia, and South America. It would take months to recall them. Worse, the Confederacy had captured several major Union naval facilities when Southern states seceded. The Norfolk Navy Yard in Virginia, the Pensacola Navy Yard in Florida, and various smaller facilities were now in Confederate hands. The South had gained valuable shipbuilding infrastructure, skilled workers, and supplies. The North had lost them. The mission was daunting beyond comprehension. Welles needed to blockade 3,500 miles of coastline. The Confederate coast had 189 harbors and navigable rivers. Major ports included Norfolk, Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and New Orleans. Dozens of smaller ports could handle blockade runners. Thousands of inlets and sounds offered refuge to small vessels. The Carolina coast alone had over 200 potential entry points. A proper naval blockade, according to international law, required the blockading force to be present and effective. Ships had to be stationed close enough to ports that blockade runners would be at genuine risk. Simply declaring a blockade wasn't sufficient. The Union had to actually stop ships from entering and leaving Confederate ports, or the blockade would be legally void and European powers would ignore it. The mathematics seemed impossible. To effectively blockade even the major ports would require positioning multiple ships at each harbor entrance, with additional vessels patrolling between ports. The ships needed to stay on station for weeks at a time in all weather conditions. They needed to be fast enough to chase blockade runners, powerful enough to fight Confederate raiders, and numerous enough to cover every potential escape route. Navy Secretary Wells calculated that he needed at least 200 ships to establish even a moderately effective blockade. He had 42, many unsuitable for the task. Naval analysts predicted that even if Wells got his 200 ships, the blockade would be so porous as to be nearly worthless. Blockade runners would simply avoid patrolled areas and use the hundreds of unguarded locations. The Confederacy shared this analysis. They believed the blockade was a political gesture that would prove ineffective in practice. They were about to discover that Union industrial capacity could solve problems that seemed mathematically impossible. Wells' first action was to recall every available ship to American waters. Vessels were summoned from African anti-slavery patrols, from South American stations, from Mediterranean and Asian posts. The process took months, but by fall of 1861, he had assembled roughly 90 ships, still far short of what he needed. His second action was revolutionary. He would build new ships at unprecedented speed and scale. Wells went to Lincoln with an audacious proposal. The Navy would contract with every available northern shipyard to build blockading vessels. Not complex warships requiring years of construction, but simple, fast, shallow draft steamers that could be built in months. Merchant ships would be purchased and converted. Even ferry boats would be armed and pressed into service. Lincoln approved immediately. By summer 1861, northern shipyards were working around the clock on naval contracts. The Union began the largest naval construction program in history to that point. And critically, they had the industrial capacity to actually do it. The North possessed everything needed for massive naval construction. Iron works could provide boilerplate and machinery. Foundries could cast cannons. Timber was abundant. Skilled shipwrights were plentiful. Most importantly, the North had the coal and iron to fuel a steel-hungry construction boom. Shipyards in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and other cities competed for Navy contracts, each trying to build ships faster than their rivals. By the end of 1861, the Union had 136 ships in commission. By end of 1862, 270. By 1864, over 400. At the war's end in April 1865, the Union Navy operated 671 vessels, making it temporarily the world's largest navy, surpassing even Britain's Royal Navy in number of ships. The Confederacy tried to respond, but couldn't match Union production. They captured some Union vessels when ports fell to Confederate hands. They purchased a few ships from British shipyards. They converted civilian steamers into makeshift warships. But they never had the industrial base to build a proper navy. At peak strength, the Confederate Navy operated about 50 vessels of all types. Many were riverboats, not seagoing warships. Some were ironclads that never left port due to mechanical problems. The Confederate Navy was brave, sometimes innovative, but always hopelessly outnumbered and outbuilt. The industrial gap was decisive. Union shipyards could build a standard blockading vessel in 4 to 6 months. By 1863, they were completing multiple ships per month. The Confederacy would start building a warship and discover halfway through construction that they couldn't get the iron for the boilers, or the copper for the sheathing, or the timber for the decking. Projects would drag on for years, and many were never completed. This was the pattern repeating again. Union industrial capacity solving problems through mass production. Need 200 ships? Build 600. Can't blockade every inlet? Build so many ships that it doesn't matter where blockade runners try to hide. Lose ships to storms or combat? Build replacements faster than they're lost. The Confederacy couldn't compete with this industrial approach because they lacked the factories, materials, and skills to match it. By 1863, The blockade had transformed from a porous gesture into an increasingly effective stranglehold. Union ships patrolled in coordinated squadrons. Fast steam vessels chased blockade runners. Slow-sailing ships maintained presence at major ports. The North Atlantic blockading squadron covered Virginia and North Carolina. The South Atlantic squadron covered South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. The Gulf Squadron covered Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. The Mississippi River Squadron controlled the inland waters. At peak deployment, over 500 Union warships were actively engaged in blockade duty. This was more than 10 times the number the Confederacy could field. The mathematical impossibility of April 1861 had become the crushing reality of 1863 through sheer industrial production. The Union had built their way to naval dominance in less than 3 years. The blockade runners were the Confederacy's desperate response to Union naval power. These vessels represented perhaps the most dangerous and romantic aspect of the Civil War, though the reality was far grimmer than the romantic image suggests. Blockade running was a business, usually a profitable one, but it was also slowly strangling the Confederate war effort even when it succeeded. The economics of blockade running were irresistible to private shippers. A vessel that could reach Nassau or Bermuda with cotton, then return with manufactured goods, could earn profits of 300 to 700% on a single voyage. Cotton purchased in Charleston for 6 cents per pound sold for 60 cents in Nassau. British manufactured goods bought cheap in Bermuda sold for 10 times their cost in Confederate ports. Successful captains became wealthy. Ship owners made fortunes. But these economic incentives worked against the Confederate war effort. Blockade runners carried what made profit, not what the Confederacy needed most. A ship's cargo hold had limited capacity. Every bale of cotton meant less space for rifles or medicine. Every luxury item for wealthy Southerners meant fewer military supplies. Blockade runners maximized profit by carrying high-value civilian goods like champagne, corsets, and tea, while military supplies like salt, medicine, and lead took up valuable space for less profit. The Confederate government tried to regulate this by requiring that half of each ship's cargo to be military supplies. But enforcement was spotty, and private shippers constantly found ways around regulations. Even when ships carried military goods, the economics were perverse. It was more profitable to ship 100 rifles than 100 barrels of salt pork, even though the Army needed the salt pork desperately and had adequate rifles. The vessels themselves evolved to meet the blockade's challenges. Early in the war, runners used ordinary merchant ships. As the Union blockade tightened, specialized vessels appeared. These purpose-built runners were engineering marvels designed for one thing: speed and stealth. They sat low in the water to reduce visibility. They were painted gray or pale blue to blend with sea and sky. They burned smokeless anthracite coal to avoid detection. Their engines were powerful but heavily muffled. Many had telescoping funnels that could be lowered when approaching the blockade line. The most famous runners were British-built vessels from Clyde and Liverpool shipyards. Ships like the CSS Robert E. Lee, Colonel Lamb, and Let Her Be were fast, purpose-built runners that could outpace most Union blockading vessels. The Robert E. Lee made 21 successful runs through the blockade before finally being captured in November 1864. Each run netted her owners massive profits while carrying relatively little military value to the Confederacy. The typical blockade running route started in Confederate ports like Wilmington or Charleston. The runners would wait for moonless nights or poor weather when Union blockaders couldn't see clearly. They would slip out of port at high tide, running with minimal lights, depending on local pilots who knew every sandbar and channel. Once clear of the immediate coast, they would race for neutral ports in the Bahamas or Bermuda, usually Nassau or St. George. These British colonial ports became thriving centers of the blockade-running trade, with warehouses full of cotton awaiting shipment to Europe and manufactured goods awaiting the return voyage to the Confederacy. In Nassau, the cotton would be transferred to conventional merchant ships for transport to European markets. British goods would be loaded for the return run. The runners would wait for favorable conditions, then make the reverse voyage, approaching Confederate ports at night, timing their arrival for high tide, racing past Union blockaders in darkness, and reaching the safety of port batteries that kept Union ships at a distance. The statistics reveal both the success and ultimate failure of blockade running. In 1861, Roughly 90% of blockade running attempts succeeded. The Union blockade was too thin and poorly coordinated to stop most runners. In 1862, success rates dropped to about 75% as more Union ships joined the blockade squadrons. By 1863, approximately 60% of runs succeeded, but Union captures were increasing. In 1864, success rates fell to roughly 50%, meaning blockade runners had only even odds of getting through. In the war's final months, success rates dropped below 40%. Over the entire war, blockade runners attempted about 1,500 voyages. The Union captured or destroyed approximately 1,100 vessels, a capture rate of over 70%. This meant that even successful shipping companies lost multiple vessels. The high profits from successful runs had to cover the losses from captured ships, and increasingly, they didn't. More devastating than the capture rate was what the statistics meant for Confederate supply. Even when blockade runners succeeded, they weren't bringing what the Confederacy needed most. A typical successful runner might carry 200 tons of cargo. In 1 month, even with a dozen successful runs, that meant 2,400 tons of goods reaching the Confederacy. Meanwhile, the Union was moving hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies monthly via railroad to their armies. The blockade runners were barely keeping the Confederacy alive, let alone supplying them adequately for war. The human cost was significant too. Blockade running crews suffered from Union naval gunfire, drowning when ships ran aground in darkness, and imprisonment when captured. Union blockading ships had equally dangerous duty, spending months at sea in all weather conditions, chasing runners through dangerous coastal waters, and occasionally being destroyed by Confederate shore batteries or the rare raider that broke through. Captain Joanne Wiley of the blockade runner Let Her Be described the experience. You leave port in total darkness, every man aboard, knowing that Federal ships wait somewhere ahead. The engines must run full power but silently. You watch the horizon for any sign of Union vessels. Sometimes you see them, dark shapes against slightly lighter sky. You alter course, praying they haven't seen you. Sometimes they have. Then comes the chase, your ship running all out, shells falling around you, praying to God you're faster than they are. I lost 3 ships to capture and 1 to grounding, made 21 successful runs and retired wealthy. But I watched good men die for profit margins. The blockade runners kept the Confederacy breathing, but barely. By 1863, Confederate quartermasters calculated that blockade runners were supplying roughly 10% of what the armies needed. The other 90% had to come from domestic production, which was completely inadequate. This created the situation described in our first video about Confederate soldiers discovering Union food abundance. Those starving Confederate troops weren't starving because food didn't exist in the world. They were starving because the Union blockade prevented European and Caribbean food shipments from reaching southern ports. The connection between naval blockade and army starvation was direct and mathematical. A typical blockade runner carried perhaps 30 tons of food in a successful run. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia alone needed approximately 200 tons of food daily to properly feed its soldiers. Even if every single blockade runner carried only food, which they didn't, dozens of successful runs would be needed daily just to feed one army. The Confederacy had multiple armies. The math never worked. Private John Dooley, who we met in Video 1 discovering that Union haversack at Cedar Mountain, was starving partly because ships like the Robert E. Lee were carrying luxury goods to Charleston instead of salt pork. The naval war 800 miles away was determining whether he ate or starved, and increasingly, he starved. By 1864, the Union blockade had evolved from a loose net with large holes into an increasingly tight stranglehold. The transformation happened through systematic application of industrial resources and organizational improvement. The Union didn't just add more ships, though they did that. They also got smarter about how to use them. Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter pioneered many of the tactics that made the later blockade so effective. Porter understood that simply parking ships outside harbors wasn't sufficient. Blockade runners were too fast and too skilled at using darkness and weather. The Union needed a more sophisticated approach. Porter's innovation was the coordinated squadron system. Instead of individual ships operating independently, Union vessels worked in groups with defined roles. Fast steamers formed an outer line 15 to 20 miles from shore, positioned to intercept runners heading for neutral ports. Slower but more heavily armed ships formed an inner line close to Confederate harbors, positioned to catch runners attempting to enter or leave port. Small gunboats patrolled the spaces between, watching for runners trying to slip through gaps. This layered defense meant blockade runners faced multiple chances of interception. Even if they evaded the outer line, the inner line waited. Even if they slipped past both, gunboats patrolled between them. The Union was applying industrial management principles to naval warfare: multiple checkpoints, redundant systems, continuous coverage. Porter also pioneered night operations using calcium lights, powerful searchlights that could suddenly illuminate large areas of ocean. When Union lookouts spotted a suspicious shape in darkness, searchlights would snap on, catching runners in brilliant light that destroyed their stealth advantage. Many runners were captured within minutes of being illuminated, their speed advantage meaningless once they were visible. The Union Navy also used intelligence systematically. They tracked which runners operated from which ports, learning their patterns and preferences. They monitored arrivals and departures in Nassau and Bermuda, calculating when runners would attempt the return voyage. They intercepted Confederate communications about planned runs. By 1864, Union blockade commanders often knew when and where runners would attempt to break through, positioning extra vessels accordingly. The technological improvements were equally important. Early Union blockading ships were a mixed collection of converted merchants, old sailing vessels, and whatever could be pressed into service. By 1864, purpose-built blockading vessels were entering service. These ships were designed specifically for their mission: fast enough to chase runners, shallow draft to operate in coastal waters, heavily armed to fight Confederate raiders, and equipped with the latest engines and equipment. The USS Sassacus, commissioned in 1864, exemplified the new generation. She could make 12 knots, fast for the era. She drew only 11 feet of water, allowing her to pursue runners into shallow harbors. She mounted 4 large guns and multiple smaller weapons. She had powerful searchlights and the latest navigation equipment. Most importantly, she was one of dozens of similar vessels, representing Union industrial capacity, turning out specialized warships at unprecedented rates. By mid-1864, the Union had over 400 ships on blockade duty. The Confederate coastline was covered by a floating wall of Union vessels so thick that blockade runners often couldn't find gaps. The few routes that remained open were heavily patrolled and extremely dangerous. Success rates plummeted. Insurance costs for blockade running became prohibitive. The profits that had driven the trade were no longer sufficient to justify the risks. Confederate naval officer John Taylor Wood described the situation in his diary. "The blockade has become impenetrable in most locations. Where once we had dozens of options for runners, now we have perhaps 3 or 4 ports where running is even possible. Wilmington remains open, barely. Charleston is nearly sealed. Mobile is closed. Galveston is isolated. The Union has so many ships that they can afford to have vessels under repair and still maintain coverage. We destroy 1 and 3 more appear." This is not warfare, but industrial suffocation. The closure of major Confederate ports followed a predictable pattern. The Union would build up overwhelming naval force, then cooperate with Army forces to capture the port city. Once captured, that port became a Union base, allowing blockading ships to refuel and resupply without traveling to distant northern ports. Each captured Confederate port made the blockade more effective by providing forward bases closer to the action. New Orleans fell in April 1862 to a combined Union naval and Army operation. This was catastrophic for the Confederacy. New Orleans was the South's largest city and most important port. Its capture closed the mouth of the Mississippi River to Confederate shipping and gave the Union control of a major industrial center. The loss resonated throughout the Confederacy. If New Orleans could fall, nowhere was safe. Mobile Bay fell in August 1864 after Admiral David Farragut's famous fleet action. Farragut led Union warships through mine-filled waters into Mobile Bay, defeating the defending Confederate fleet and closing the port. Farragut's declaration, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," became legendary, but the strategic result was more important than the tactical drama. Mobile's closure meant one less port for blockade runners. Fort Fisher, which protected Wilmington, fell in January 1865 after a massive Union combined operation involving 60 ships and 8,000 soldiers. Wilmington was the Confederacy's last major functioning port. Its capture effectively ended blockade, running as a viable supply method. After Fort Fisher fell, only a few small ports in Florida and Texas remained marginally open, and they handled negligible traffic. The pattern revealed the Union's systematic approach. Identify key ports. Assemble overwhelming force. Capture the port through combined naval and army operations. Convert the captured port into a Union base. Use it to support further operations. This was industrial warfare, methodical, systematic, unstoppable. But while the Union was systematically closing Confederate ports, one Confederate vessel was demonstrating that a single warship, properly employed, could terrorize Union merchant shipping across the world's oceans. The CSS Alabama would become the most successful commerce raider in naval history and the source of decades of international dispute. But ultimately, even her remarkable success couldn't overcome the fundamental economic imbalance between Union and Confederate naval power. The CSS Alabama was built in secret in British shipyards in 1862. Britain was officially neutral, but British shipbuilders saw profit in Confederate contracts. The Alabama was commissioned in the Azores in August 1862 under command of Captain Raphael Semmes, one of the Confederate Navy's most skilled officers. Semmes understood his mission perfectly. He couldn't defeat the Union blockade, but he could hurt Union commerce. If the Alabama could capture or destroy enough Union merchant ships, she might drive up insurance rates, disrupt Union trade, and force the U.S. Navy to divert vessels from blockade duty to hunt for her. Even if this didn't change the war's outcome, it might inflict enough economic damage to bring the Union to the negotiating table. Over the next 2 years, the Alabama would travel 75,000 nautical miles and capture 65 Union merchant vessels. She operated in the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. She captured ships off the coast of Massachusetts, in the Caribbean, near South Africa, in the Indian Ocean, and in the South China Sea. She was the most successful commerce raider ever to sail. Semmes' method was effective and ruthless. The Alabama would approach merchant ships flying false flags, usually British. When close enough, she would raise the Confederate ensign and demand surrender. Most merchant ships surrendered immediately rather than fight a heavily armed warship. Semmes would take off the crew and passengers, transfer any valuable cargo to the Alabama, then burn the captured ship. He treated crews decently, later transferring them to other vessels or neutral ports, but he destroyed their ships without mercy. The economic impact was substantial. Union marine insurance rates tripled. Many American merchants reflagged their ships under British or other neutral registry to avoid capture. Union shipping declined significantly during the war, though it's difficult to separate the Alabama's impact from the general disruption of wartime conditions. But the strategic impact was negligible. The Union Navy did divert some ships to hunt the Alabama, but never enough to significantly weaken the blockade. The Alabama never captured a blockading vessel or broke the blockade at any point. She never transported supplies to the Confederacy. She was a nuisance and an economic irritant, but she didn't change the war's strategic picture. Captain Semmes understood this. In his journal, he wrote, "We have burned over 60 Union vessels and disrupted their commerce significantly, but this accomplishes nothing decisive. While I hunt merchantmen in distant waters, Union blockading fleets strangle my country. Every day the blockade tightens while I capture ships that mean nothing to the war's outcome. I am winning tactical victories that add up to strategic irrelevance." The Alabama's career ended in June 1864 off Cherbourg, France. The USS Kearsarge, a Union warship that had been hunting the Alabama for months, caught her in port. Semmes, feeling his honor demanded it, steamed out to fight rather than remain interned. The battle lasted barely an hour. The Kearsarge's superior gunnery destroyed the Alabama, sending her to the bottom. Semmes and many of his crew were rescued by a British yacht and escaped to England, eventually returning to the Confederacy. The Alabama's destruction symbolized the Confederacy's naval position perfectly. One brilliant captain and one excellent ship had achieved tactical success across 2 years and 75,000 miles of ocean, but the Union had hundreds of ships maintaining the blockade, dozens more hunting commerce raiders, and the industrial capacity to replace any losses. The Alabama sank 65 Union merchants. Union shipyards built hundreds of replacements. One commerce raider couldn't overcome industrial capacity that could absorb any loss and continue operations without pause. The Alabama controversy would continue long after the war. The United States claimed that Britain had violated neutrality by allowing Confederate vessels to be built in British yards. The resulting Alabama claims would nearly bring the U.S. and Britain to war in the 1870s before being resolved by international arbitration. Britain eventually paid $15.5 million in compensation, but during the war itself, the Alabama was ultimately a strategic dead end, a brilliant tactical success that changed nothing about the blockade, slowly strangling the Confederacy. By 1865, the Union blockade had transformed the Confederate economy from stressed to catastrophic. The statistics tell a story of economic collapse so complete that it made continued military resistance nearly impossible. This was the blockade's real achievement, not just preventing supplies from reaching the South, but destroying the economic foundation necessary to sustain modern warfare. Inflation was the most visible symptom of economic collapse. In the Confederate States, prices rose steadily throughout the war, but the curve became nearly vertical in 1864 and 65. The Confederate dollar, worth 100 cents in gold in 1861, was worth 12 cents in 1863, 2 cents in 1864, and less than 2/10 of 1 cent by war's end in April 1865. This wasn't just currency fluctuation. This was economic disintegration. A pound of bacon cost 12 cents in Richmond in 1861. By 1865, that same pound cost $9. A pound of coffee cost 30 cents in 1861, $15 in 1865. A barrel of flour cost $7 in 1861, $500 in 1865. These aren't just large numbers. They represent the impossibility of maintaining an army, let alone a civilian economy. Confederate soldiers were paid $11 per month in 1861. That pay, even if delivered regularly, which it often wasn't, could barely buy 2 pounds of bacon by 1865. The money was becoming worthless faster than it could be spent. The inflation was caused by multiple factors, but the blockade was primary. The Confederacy had no significant gold reserves and limited taxation capability. They financed the war by printing money. Under normal circumstances, this would cause severe inflation, but the blockade made it catastrophic by preventing the import of goods that could absorb the currency. In a functioning economy, increased money supply leads to increased imports to balance inflation. The Confederacy couldn't import because of the blockade. The printed money chased a shrinking supply of goods, driving prices into the stratosphere. Every month, the blockade prevented more imports while the Confederate government printed more money. The spiral was mathematically certain to end in collapse. Judith McGuire, a Richmond resident, kept a diary documenting the inflation's impact. In 1862, I could purchase a week's provisions for my family for $10. In 1863, $25. In 1864, $100. Now, in March of 1865, I spent $300 for provisions that would last perhaps 4 days. This is not an economy, but a nightmare. People are starving not because food doesn't exist, but because no one can afford it. The blockade's impact on Confederate government finance was equally devastating. The Confederacy had based its entire financial strategy on cotton exports. They would sell cotton to Europe, use the revenue to purchase bonds, and use bond sales to finance the war. The blockade destroyed this plan completely. Confederate bonds were initially popular in Europe. In 1861 and early 1862, European investors purchased Confederate bonds, believing the South would win independence and the bonds would be repaid with interest. But as the blockade tightened and cotton exports collapsed, Confederate bonds became worthless. By 1864, Confederate bonds traded at 15 cents on the dollar. By war's end, they were literally worthless paper. The Confederate government tried multiple schemes to work around the blockade. They attempted to establish credit lines with European banks using cotton as collateral. They tried to purchase supplies on credit. They attempted barter arrangements. Nothing worked because everyone understood that Confederate victory was becoming increasingly unlikely, and Confederate currency and credit were tied to that outcome. Secretary of Treasury Christopher Memminger reported to President Davis in 1864, We are bankrupt in all but name. Our currency is worthless. Our bonds sell at ruinous discounts if they sell at all. Our credit abroad is exhausted. The blockade has ensured that our primary asset, cotton, cannot reach markets. We are reduced to financing the war by printing money that no one wants and issuing bonds that no one will buy. This cannot continue indefinitely. It continued for one more year, but barely. By early 1865, the Confederate economy existed in name only. Government employees often went unpaid for months. Soldiers received their $11 monthly pay irregularly, and when they did receive it, it bought almost nothing. Civilians in cities like Richmond were literally starving because food was either unavailable or unaffordable. The Richmond bread riot in April 1863 had been an early warning. Hundreds of women, desperate to feed their families, had marched on the Confederate War Department demanding bread. The riot was suppressed, but it revealed how precarious civilian survival had become. By 1865, similar desperation existed everywhere in the Confederacy, but people no longer had the energy to riot. They just endured and starved quietly. The connection to military effectiveness was direct. Armies fight on logistics. Soldiers need food, ammunition, uniforms, medicine, and equipment. All of these require money to purchase or materials to manufacture or trade goods to barter. The Confederacy had none of these in adequate supply because the blockade had destroyed their ability to acquire them. Remember John Dooley from Video 1, the Confederate soldier who discovered that Union haversack filled with real coffee and fresh meat? His hunger was created by the Union Navy 800 miles away. Blockade runners that might have carried food were carrying luxury goods for profit. Confederate money that might have purchased domestic food was worthless due to inflation caused by the blockade. European food that might have been imported sat in warehouses because ships couldn't get through the blockade. The naval blockade and the Confederate Army's starvation were not separate issues. They were the same issue viewed from different perspectives. Union Admiral David Porter later wrote, "We strangled the Confederacy economically, which made it impossible for them to feed their armies, which made Confederate military defeat inevitable." The blockade didn't win battles, but it made winning battles irrelevant for the Confederacy. You cannot sustain military resistance when your economy has collapsed and your soldiers are starving. By December 1864, the military situation for the Confederacy was desperate but not yet hopeless. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia still held Petersburg and Richmond. Johnston commanded forces in the Carolinas. Taylor had an army in Alabama and Mississippi. On paper, the Confederacy could still field significant forces, but the economic reality made continued resistance increasingly futile. Lee's army around Petersburg was starving. We covered this in Video 1 about Confederate food shortages, but the blockade was a root cause of that starvation. Supplies that might have reached Lee's army through Wilmington were blocked by Union ships. European food that might have been purchased with cotton revenue couldn't be acquired because cotton couldn't be sold. Domestic food production was insufficient and couldn't be supplemented by imports because of the blockade. In February 1865, Lee wrote to Secretary of War John Breckinridge, "The Army is starving, not gradually becoming hungry, but actively starving. Men are too weak to march. Units are dissolving through desertion as soldiers leave to find food for their families. I cannot maintain military operations under these conditions. The troops will fight with whatever strength they have remaining, but that strength diminishes daily. Unless substantial supplies arrive soon, this army will cease to exist, not through battlefield defeat, but through starvation and desertion." No substantial supplies arrived. The blockade ensured they couldn't. Wilmington, the Confederacy's last major port, had fallen to Union forces in January. The few remaining minor ports in Texas and Florida were too distant and too small to matter. Blockade running, which had kept a trickle of supplies flowing, was essentially dead. The Confederacy was sealed in an economic coffin with the lid nailed shut. Sherman's march through Georgia and then north into the Carolinas demonstrated the Confederacy's helplessness in the face of coordinated Union operations. Sherman's army lived off the countryside, destroying railroads and supplies as they advanced. Confederate forces couldn't stop him because they lacked the supplies to maintain effective military operations. They couldn't concentrate forces because they couldn't feed them if concentrated. They couldn't maneuver because their soldiers were too weak from hunger to march long distances. This was the ultimate result of the blockade. It made Confederate military resistance physically impossible. Courage, tactics, and generalship all became irrelevant when armies couldn't be fed or supplied. The Union didn't have to defeat Confederate armies in battle. They just had to wait while the blockade slowly strangled Confederate logistics until resistance collapsed on its own. By March 1865, informed observers in both the Union and Confederacy understood the war was effectively over. Lee's army was trapped at Petersburg, slowly starving. Sherman was advancing north through the Carolinas, facing only token resistance. Confederate armies in the West were isolated and irrelevant. The Confederate government's authority was collapsing as desertion skyrocketed and civilian morale disintegrated. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. Lee's army broke out of Petersburg on April 2nd, but was too weak to escape Grant's pursuit. Starving men couldn't march fast enough. Exhausted horses couldn't pull artillery. The army disintegrated while retreating, men falling out by thousands, too exhausted to continue. By April 9th at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee had fewer than 28,000 effective soldiers remaining from an army that had numbered over 60,000 days earlier. The difference wasn't battlefield casualties. It was starvation, exhaustion, and desertion. Lee's decision to surrender was partly based on military realities, but economic factors were equally decisive. His army was surrounded, outnumbered, and without supplies. Even if they broke through Grant's lines, where would they go? What would they eat? How would they continue fighting? The blockade had ensured there were no supplies to reach. No ports remained open. No economic base existed to support continued resistance. Surrender wasn't just militarily necessary, it was economically inevitable. General Edward Porter Alexander, Lee's artillery commander, later wrote, "We surrendered at Appomattox not because we had been defeated in battle, though we had, but because continuing to fight was physically impossible. Our men were starving. We had no supplies and no way to get supplies. The Union blockade had strangled our economy so completely that even if we had escaped Grant's army, we would have dissolved anyway for lack of food. The blockade won the war more surely than any battlefield victory. After Lee's surrender, remaining Confederate forces collapsed rapidly. Johnston surrendered to Sherman in North Carolina on April 26. Taylor surrendered in Alabama on May 4th. The last Confederate army, in Texas, surrendered on May 26th. The Confederate government, such as it existed, dissolved. President Davis was captured in Georgia while attempting to flee. The Union blockade remained in place until President Johnson formally declared it ended in June 1865. By then, it had accomplished its mission completely. The Confederacy was not just defeated militarily, but destroyed economically. The Southern economy would take decades to recover from the combination of war damage and blockade-induced collapse. The numbers tell the story starkly. In 1860, the South produced and exported nearly 4 million bales of cotton worth approximately $200 million. In 1865, cotton production was under 300,000 bales, and exports were negligible. The economic engine that was supposed to power Confederate independence had been throttled by Union naval power. The blockade captured or destroyed over 1,100 vessels attempting to run supplies to the Confederacy. It reduced Southern imports to less than 10% of pre-war levels. It caused inflation that made Confederate currency worthless and destroyed government finances. It created the supply shortages that led to army starvation and civilian suffering. It proved that in industrial warfare, controlling sea lanes mattered more than controlling territory. Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, reflected on the blockade in his 1866 report to Congress. The naval blockade of the Confederate coast was the most extensive and effective blockade ever implemented. It sealed off 3,500 miles of coastline, captured over 1,000 vessels, and strangled the Confederate economy. The blockade did not win spectacular battles. It did not generate headlines, but it made Confederate victory impossible by destroying their economic capacity to wage war. This was naval power applied systematically and overwhelmingly, demonstrating that modern war is won by controlling commerce and resources, not just by battlefield glory. The blockade also demonstrated the power of Union industrial capacity. The U.S. Navy expanded from 42 ships in April 1861 to 671 ships by war's end. This represented the largest naval construction program to that date in history. Northern shipyards built vessels faster than the Confederacy could build blockade runners. Northern foundries cast more guns than the Confederacy could manufacture for coastal defense. Northern coal mines fueled more ships than the Confederate Navy could operate. The pattern repeated across every aspect of the war. Union industrial capacity overwhelmed Confederate agricultural economy. The blockade was this pattern applied to naval warfare. The Confederacy had cotton and courage. The Union had shipyards and systematic organization. Cotton and courage weren't enough. For the Confederacy, the blockade represented their greatest strategic miscalculation. They believed cotton diplomacy would force European intervention. They were catastrophically wrong. They believed King Cotton would rule. They discovered that industrial sea power ruled instead. They believed they could sustain their economy through blockade running. They discovered that profit-driven shipping couldn't replace legitimate commerce. James Hamilton, the cotton merchant we met at Port Royal in November 1861, watching Union warships seal the harbor, survived the war. His 40,000 bales of cotton sat in warehouses, rotting slowly until Union forces captured Port Royal and confiscated them. His fortune evaporated. His family's wealth disappeared. His faith in King Cotton proved to be delusion. Hamilton later wrote in his memoir, published in 1873, "We believed cotton made us invincible. We were fools. Cotton only made us wealthy, and wealth without the power to protect it is meaningless. The Union didn't need our cotton badly enough to break the blockade. Britain didn't need our cotton badly enough to risk war. We bet everything on an asset that proved worthless the moment the Union Navy appeared off our coasts. Our entire economic strategy was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of power. We had wealth. The Union had ships. Ships beat wealth every time." The blockade also revealed the importance of geography in warfare. The Confederacy had an enormous coastline and believed this made them impossible to blockade effectively. They were wrong. The same long coastline that seemed like an advantage actually helped the Union. Every Confederate port required garrison troops and coastal defenses. Every inlet needed defending. The Confederacy spread their limited military resources across thousands of miles of coast, while the Union concentrated their abundant naval resources at key points. More fundamentally, the Confederacy's geographical position made them vulnerable. They were surrounded by Union forces, the U.S. Navy offshore, Union armies north and west. The Confederacy had interior lines in some respects, but they were trapped in a defensive position from which they could never break out. The blockade turned Southern geography into a prison, sealing the Confederacy inside borders they couldn't defend and couldn't break through. The human cost of the blockade is harder to quantify than military casualties, but was equally real. Thousands died from malnutrition-related diseases exacerbated by inability to import medicine. Thousands more died from wounds that would have healed with proper medical supplies that couldn't get through the blockade. Civilians starved in cities, blockaded on land, and sealed from sea. The indirect casualties from blockade-induced economic collapse likely exceeded direct battle casualties, though precise numbers are impossible to determine. The blockade also destroyed Southern wealth systematically. Plantations that had been worth millions became nearly worthless. Cotton that couldn't be sold became a liability rather than an asset. Ships trapped in port by the blockade were economic losses. The entire Southern economy, built around exporting agricultural products and importing manufactured goods, collapsed when the blockade prevented both exports and imports. This wealth destruction had consequences lasting decades beyond the war. The South emerged from the Civil War economically devastated. Capital was destroyed. Infrastructure was ruined. The economic system based on slavery was abolished. The blockade had ensured that even the cotton-based wealth that might have survived the war's other damages was gone. The post-war South had to rebuild economically from almost nothing, while the North's economy boomed from wartime industrial expansion. By 1865, the United States Navy had proven that modern naval power could accomplish what armies alone couldn't. It could destroy an enemy's economic capacity to wage war without needing to occupy their territory or defeat their armies in decisive battles. The blockade was patient, systematic, and ultimately irresistible. The Confederacy could win tactical victories, could even win battles, but couldn't overcome the slow economic strangulation that the blockade imposed. The The lessons of the Civil War blockade would shape naval thinking for the next century. During World War I, Britain would blockade Germany, causing widespread starvation and contributing significantly to German defeat. During World War II, Allied submarines would blockade Japan, strangling their economy and making continued resistance impossible even before the atomic bombs fell. The Civil War blockade was the prototype for modern economic warfare. Use naval power to cut off an enemy's access to resources, wait for their economy to collapse, then accept their inevitable surrender. This was warfare transformed. Not glorious cavalry charges or heroic infantry assaults, but patient, systematic economic pressure applied relentlessly until resistance became impossible. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. But it was devastatingly effective. The Union blockade proved that in modern warfare, controlling commerce matters more than courage, and industrial capacity matters more than tactical brilliance. Admiral David Dixon Porter summarized the blockade's significance in an 1866 speech. "We built a navy from almost nothing. We blockaded a coastline that experts said couldn't be blockaded. We captured over 1,000 vessels. We destroyed the Confederate economy. We proved that naval power, properly applied, could be more decisive than armies. The Confederacy had brave soldiers, skilled generals, and powerful will to resist. But they couldn't overcome the simple fact that we controlled the seas, and they didn't. That control determined the war's outcome more surely than any battle. For the Confederate soldiers starving in trenches at Petersburg in early 1865, the connection between naval warfare and their empty stomachs wasn't obvious. They didn't see the Union blockading ships offshore. They didn't understand the economic mechanisms that had destroyed Confederate purchasing power. They just knew they were hungry, and the Union soldiers across the lines were well fed. But the connection was direct and mathematical. Those Union soldiers ate well because Union supply lines functioned. Union supply lines functioned because the Union economy was intact. The Union economy was intact because the Union controlled the seas and maintained their commerce. The Confederacy couldn't feed its soldiers because Confederate supply lines had collapsed. Confederate supply lines had collapsed because the Confederate economy was destroyed. The Confederate economy was destroyed because the Union blockade had sealed them off from world markets. One led to the other as inevitably as night follows day. The blockade didn't win battles, but it made battles irrelevant. Confederate armies could fight brilliantly, could even win tactically, but they were slowly starving because ships they would never see were patrolling waters hundreds of miles away, intercepting supplies they desperately needed. This was modern warfare, distant, abstract, but more deadly than any battle. When Confederate soldiers finally surrendered in April and May of 1865, many were too weak from hunger to march to surrender ceremonies. Union soldiers, watching their emaciated enemies lay down weapons, understood they had been fighting men who had already lost, not through battlefield defeat, but through economic starvation. The pity they felt was genuine. So, was there recognition that the blockade had accomplished what battlefield victories alone never could? It had made continued Confederate resistance not just militarily defeated, but physically impossible. If you've made it this far into this deep dive into Civil War naval warfare, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. There are hundreds more untold stories from America's defining conflict, and I'm bringing you a new one regularly. This is history that textbooks skip, but that determined the war's outcome more than the famous battles everyone knows. Now, I want to hear your perspective. If you were a Confederate government official in November 1861 watching Union warships seal off Port Royal, knowing your entire economic strategy depended on cotton exports, what would you have done differently? Could the Confederacy have broken the blockade with different tactics? Or was Union industrial superiority simply too overwhelming? And here's the harder question. If you were running a blockade-running operation, would you have prioritized military supplies even knowing luxury goods were far more profitable? Would you have chosen the Confederacy's desperate need over personal fortune? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The best historical discussions happen down there, and I read every single comment. The ethics of profit versus patriotism during wartime are as relevant today as they were in 1863, and your perspectives matter.